Hello and welcome to Dairy Pod. I'm Kristen Davis from Dairy Australia. In this episode, DairyTas Extension Team Lead, Liz Mann, is joined by Dr Richard Rawnsley. Richard is the R&D Lead for Sustainable Dairy at Fonterra, as well as an academic lead for the Livestock Production Centre at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. Listen to Liz and Richard as they discuss different climate myths and provide guidance on where farmers can start in understanding their greenhouse gas emissions.
Hi and welcome to this episode of Dairy Pod, Richard. Thanks for joining me today.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me, Liz.
Now, you and I have been meaning to record this episode for a little while now. It's probably a bit on both of us because we've been a bit busy, but not to lay blame.
No.
One of the main reasons it's taken us a while is you've been working on a research trial. What have you been working on?
Yeah, so I do, as you know, there's a bit of work both for Fonterra and the Tasmanian Institute of Ag. So we've had a number of feeding trials, both farmer-facing ones and some of the research farms, just trying to understand, in particular, assessments around what we call the Fonterra, in particular around the four goods. So we want to understand whether some of the feed additives that we look at are good for the cow, good for the farmer, good for the milk, and then obviously good for the environment. So yeah, bit of research trials going on, understanding feed additives around that are available. You know, there's some really important components for them to be adopted that we need to understand, and they do relate to those things that they've got to be able to, in a way, be good for the cow. So the cow needs to be able to respond in a positive way or something, not a negative way. Needs to be good for our milk, so I understand, you know, milk residue limits and things like that. We talk about being good for the farmer, which is about understanding, you know, what is those price points that make sense, and whilst, you know, that some of those might have a little bit of room to go, we want to see where that sits at the moment, and so what's the likely adoption pathway. And then good for the environment's more around that measurement of, do they do what they say what they're meant to do. So we're building some capability here in Tassie, particularly through involvement with the Tasmanian Institute of Ag. But one of the other components is there's been some really great science done on a number of these feed additives that have built a body of literature around what levels of methane abatement are likely. But when you move from a very controlled research environment to one that's more of a commercial, you know, more farmer-facing and scale, then understanding those scalabilities, practicalities.
Now, you did mention there that you work for Fonterra and TIA.
Yep.
Interesting, wearing two different hats. And, you know, most people in the Tasmanian dairy industry probably know who you are, but not everyone does. What's your background? Where have you come from?
Yes, I haven't come from far. I haven't gone far. I'm born and bred Tasmanian and can't get off the island, but that's me. Yeah, certainly love being part of the Tassie dairy industry. I actually don't come off a dairy farm, which is interesting, but I got involved with dairy early on in my undergraduate program through a summer studentship. And yeah, I've been pretty passionate about since then. And so I just found that very collegial, very supportive, and throughout my journey as part of the industry, I've met some wonderful people, you know, lifelong friends, but also just that collegial support. So they get an opportunity to visit farms, and always find through the farmer engagement that you come away knowing more than you did when you went there, and the farmers are very generous with their time and knowledge. You come away with lots of ideas and questions, and if you can give a little bit of back on the way, then that's great as well. But yeah, I've certainly been able to learn a lot, I think, from others, and so I'm really appreciative of that, and continue to invest my time and energy in the industry, and so really appreciative of that.
As I said, we have been around the industry for a little while, and you know, we've seen a lot of change, but you are right, it is a very collaborative industry. We do work really well together, and we could probably sit here and discuss solving all the world's problems if we wanted to. Now, the reason I did want to sit down and have this chat with you today was back in March, which we did mention it's taken us a while.
So catch up since then,
Yes. You presented at the Tasmanian Dairy Conference around the myths of methane and greenhouse gas and the like. One of the things you talked about there was there was like 3 or 4 myths, but March was a while ago now. We're recording this late June.
Yep.
Few things have changed in the just general dairy environment in terms that, you know, Tassie here, it's quite a rough season, end of the season. We haven't had rain. And milk price announcements come out and it has come back. Is greenhouse gas emissions and managing our greenhouse gas emissions on farm, is that a nice to have for when it's a good season, or is this something farmers should be thinking about all the time?
Oh, yeah. So great question, because I think farmers, I'm not sure they're directly thinking about their footprint, every minute of the day.
Right.
The things they are thinking about that drives their business performance actually are really good for their footprint around emissions. So I think that's a win in a lot of ways. And so that was part of the presentation of what you can do now, what makes sense now. And so whilst greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is a global challenge, and we need to understand that global challenge and such that, we're able to turn the worm, so to speak. So we need to, in a way, get less of those greenhouse gases if we are to limit our warming of the climate. And so there's some really good science that talks about how much greenhouse gas budget we've got. I think for dairy farmers in particular, but anyone from an agricultural or agri-food sector point of view, we've got 8 billion people, to feed, and all food production systems will have a footprint. And so I think when we think about what farmers are thinking about, they're often thinking about improving efficiencies. And so, we have gone through quite a dry spell, and part of that is like, well, how do I maintain cover on my pastures? So that's really good about actually protecting soils from erosion and loss of soil carbon. They're also thinking about, well, how do I make sure that the cows are well fed and what's available, that feed? And so there's efficiencies around that, because if the cows at the back end of lactation drop off too quickly, or they lose body condition, then that might impact into next season, and therefore that's going to have knock-on effects. All of that contributes to inefficiencies, which will make the amount of emissions in the unit of product, be it a litre of milk or whatever we're producing, to be higher. So I think farmers are continually thinking about improving that, and then some more directly think about that. And so they think about, I've been quite amazed about, the interest that farmers have around what is possible now, what can I do now that not only makes sense for me and the other win-wins, but what's on the horizon that I can help contribute to. And so there are a number of farms that I've been fortunate to be close to that do challenge and are willing to trial things and take on that adoption so that we learn. And I'm really appreciative of that, but also I think it'd be fair to say that our industry is quite progressive in their efforts to do that. So I don't think they're working in isolation to the challenge either. In a way, I think it's a bit of both there. Some things that they've experienced and done well and become really effective at, being good at producing milk and being good at looking after their pastures and their cows and the environment is all a win-win, and then being more deliberate about, well, what's the step change that's coming? And that's where, the R&D framework does a lot of great work, and across the country we see some really great work exploring that. And then we got that connection between that and ready for commercial adoption. There's a gap in there between that, not some of these things are not ready for every farm, but what role can some of the farmers play to help us understand that? And so really appreciative of the role that they play in that.
Yeah. And so talking about that, going and looking, you had, I think it was 3 or 4 statements that you...
Yeah, I did. I think so, Liz. I called them milking the truth.
That's
so I better
right.
play on words. I'm not sure I'm going to get a comic career out of that. But anyway, let's see how it goes.
Cows are a source of methane and therefore responsible for climate change. Now, I've had plenty of farmers say to me, well, what about all those people in private jets flying all over the world? And
yeah, so again, so I think with a lot of things, there's elements of truth, but then you're actually milking the truth because you've failed to tell the whole part of the story. So a lot of that comes from that methane is considered a potent greenhouse gas, and so what's potent? That sounds bad, doesn't it? So you go, okay, what's a potent? And in that term, it has a higher global warming potential than CO2, which is sort of like the baseline. So we compare apples to apples in a sense. So everything's equated back to what we term CO2 equivalents or carbon dioxide equivalents, and carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But methane on a unit level, so we talk about a tonne of methane compared to a tonne of CO2, has a higher warming potential. So it traps in more of the heat. But it's in a much lower concentration in the atmosphere too. And it also is a short-lived gas compared to CO2, which is a long-lived gas, and so that has different dynamics. But when science tries to make that an even playing field so we understand that, we talk about how much heat is trapped in by that over a 100-year period. And so methane has what's called a global warming potential over 100 years of 28 compared to CO2, which is 1. And so that's how they standardise that. And so it's classed as a potent greenhouse gas. And then when a cow eats, about 6.5% of the gross energy intake is lost as methane, so she burps that out. So for every kilo, she burps out about 20. The National Greenhouse Gas Inventory says 20.7 grams of methane every time she eats a kilo of feed. And we'll know that will find its way in that atmosphere trap heat. When we look at what the balance is around that, ruminants contribute somewhere around about 4 to 5% of our greenhouse gas budget. So the world's got a greenhouse gas budget that they're working to around keeping warming below 1.5 degrees and then 2 degrees of warming. So you hear these projections. And why they're important is when we exceed that budget, it's very hard to get that down. Now, for something like CO2, that's because it's a long-lived gas in the atmosphere. For methane, it's a short-lived gas. So if we're able to turn the worm, would actually contribute to climate cooling. Unfortunately, methane in the atmosphere is continuing to go up. And so we need to actually find effective ways to do that. And that responsibility for mine sits with everyone that produces methane. So we're not immune from our responsibility in that regards, but other sources of methane also need to look at that. And then obviously the big sources that we need to look at on that greenhouse gas budget are sources of our CO2 that go in the atmosphere and the long-lived gas. So I think understanding that story doesn't give anyone a clean, immunity or a leave pass on this challenge. Likewise, we just need to understand what's possible on the ins and outs of that. So we've got a budget. Once you've spent that budget, it's going to be very hard to reverse that challenge, and that's mostly associated with those long-lived gases. Likewise, as a short-lived gas, whilst if we're not putting any more out really than we did 12 years ago, then we say we couldn't be contributing. The fact is methane in the atmosphere keeps going up. And so we've seen that acceleration over, doubling since Industrial Revolution, and the rate of change over the last 30 years has gone up quite a bit. So we need to understand all our sources of methane, and that's not just ruminants, but understand where all those sources come from and see what's possible. So, I don't think it's fair to just say cows are responsible. But doesn't mean that we get a lead pass on that. I think what we can talk about is that livestock play a really important contribution to communities, feeding people throughout the world, and that they also got this ability to convert things that we can't eat into things that are nutritional value for us. And as part of that, they've evolved process here to deal with the end of fermentation, and methane's one of them. Likewise, we know that methane's going up in the atmosphere, and so what is it that we can possibly achieve to help? That's how I view it.
Yeah. What are some of the possibilities for us to deal with methane at the cow level?
Yeah, great. So I think there's two metrics that we need to talk about. One is like net emissions, which is the total emissions that are left, and so that's highly related to productivity. Okay, so if we've got more animals, if we're producing more food from ruminants, then it's coupled to that. What we need to look at is how efficiently are we doing that, and how we've done that. So over the course of the development of, the efforts that have gone in over the last hundreds of years of breeding cows, feeding cows, we've been able to produce and feed our animals better, husbandry and all that. And so that's taken us on a path where the amount of emissions that are embedded in a litre of milk have come down. But they've somewhat plateaued because we've got to that level of the cows doing 6,000, 7,000 litres, fertility, better husbandry, all of that. In some of the more developing parts of the world where, per cow production is probably still quite low, 2,000-3,000 litres, there's still some gains there through those adoption of practices. And then when we look at where breeding's taken us, and there's some, breeding's one of those really good things because it's compounded and it lives on. And so, that ability to find lower emitting cows per unit of feed intake's a really exciting area, and there's some people across the country doing some excellent work in that space. And then we're looking for those more step change things. So can we do something around feed additives? Is there something we can feed that for every kilo of dry matter intake that the animal has, instead of producing 20.7 grams of methane, is she able to produce 15? Diet's a big part of that too. And so understanding that, measurement's really challenging and hard. So, there's a lot of work being done around, this product or that product, but our ability to keep up to evaluate them is a bit challenged. One, it's expensive. One, there's not a lot of measurement capabilities throughout the country and world. And there's too many questions to answer on all of these options. So, that's why I say we've got to put those feed additives through a very clear lens. That's why I quite like what to call the goods criteria that Fonterra have put forward. I think that's a really good way for us to look at the feed additives. So we've got all those practices we've developed over a number of years and people are adopting, and there's opportunities further for that. So the work that people do around non-productive animals, so minimising the number of non-productive animals, the fertility rates, what I'd term our productivity measure around kilos of milk solids per kilo of body weight. So getting a good level of performance out of our animals doesn't mean that, particularly for our pasture-based systems, that we want to erode profitability just by chasing higher per cow performance through a whole lot of purchase feeds. But there's a level of performance that our cows should be able to achieve that make them efficient. So in that way, we're diluting out maintenance. So there's a maintenance bill associated with every cow that she's not producing any milk from, but she's got a methane emissions associated with that. And so if we're able to then optimise her productivity through feeding and management and the like, we'll know that will lower the embedded emissions in feed as well. And then we obviously then got, there's compounding things around breeding, step changes around feed additives. So they're the ones mostly associated with methane, and then you've got your other greenhouse gases source on farm, so your management of your nitrogen inputs, where you get the energy sources from, all those sorts of things. So back to your first question, the way people have embraced change and technology and advance their farming practices, and I think sometimes we get a bit of a bad rap because people point a big stick without fully understanding of how far people have come on this journey, and also their willingness to look at stuff. So there should be, and that's been really good.
Right, so let's move on to your next statement.
Yeah,
which was dairy production is declining in the country.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have less of an effect on climate as there are less cows. Now, I reckon there's a few farmers out there who are quite concerned about dairy in Australia and the number of cows reducing.
Yeah.
Truth?
Yeah, so when I put that up, I was talking about is a little bit back to the methane as a short-lived gas. And so, again, it's factual as a short-lived gas. And so if you was at a dairy farmer that was, say, I might just give a number, say, milking 600 cows. And you was milking those 600 cows, and you was doing exactly the same that you was doing 12 years ago that you're doing today. If you look at that, then you haven't changed your footprint. And the school of thought around that would be that because a lot of that methane is now left the atmosphere, then your next year has no further contribution to the impact on the climate. Now, that would be fine if the whole climate wasn't changing in terms of its methane level, or in fact, because it would be at a steady state. But if you look, and we can log in and look at Cape Grim data now, and it's going up. And so I don't think we can grandfather away our emissions. Yeah. And so to me, that's grandfathering your emissions. And to me, I think there's an understanding of that as a short-lived gas, but it's also an opportunity. So if we're able to bring back the level of methane in the atmosphere, we'll actually have a positive effect on climate, which is good. And so when we put that same argument around the Australian dairy industry, which is, let's just say, got from 10 billion to 8 billion over a 15 or so year period, rough numbers, then the emissions associated with dairy in this country have probably come down. And they've come down because of all the things I talked about before as well. But does that remove our obligation to this problem? I don't think it does, because methane as a whole is going up. And so we don't put a boundary around things as an atmosphere. And the other part is, if we look at that and compare that, if you was the farm that was milking 600 cows and now continue to milk 600 cows, what about in other parts of the world that are milking 2 cows and now milking 4 cows that are growing? Are they more responsible than you who was milking 600? I don't think that's quite fair. But if we looked at the way that would be accounted, they would be. And so I think we've just got to balance up those understandings and go, there is an element around understanding how methane behaves in the atmosphere, and it is part of a full biogenic cycle in a sense. So methane leaves the atmosphere and then it gets broken down by things called hydroxy radicals in the atmosphere and goes back to water and CO2, and then CO2 is taken in by plants and all that. But when we look at the total understanding of greenhouse gases, and you can think of it, people use different analogies like sun beaming through a car and trapping the heat in the car, and other people use it, like the glass house trapping the heat in. I like to think of it as a sweater,
We are in Tasmania.
Yeah, because we are in Tasmania. And the sweater's getting bigger, or the cardigan's getting bigger and thicker. And so we're trapping more of that heat in. And it doesn't matter from that point of view. We all have a role and a responsibility to think about how we can limit that each day we go forward.
Yep.
And so I don't think you can grandfather your emissions away. What you can talk about is your point source at this time of where you've changed that. And the other part of that, the 2 billion litres that we no longer produce or not produce in Australia, there's displacement of that. They're going to be produced somewhere else in the world as well. And so the globe says that. And so we have seen dairy production globally continue to go up around 2-3%. And it's not cool, we've got more people to feed. And dairy's a very, important part of our diet and nutritionally very important. So, what we need to think about is what can we do as part of our footprint as a dairy production system that can have a lower footprint. So it's about the efficiency of the way we do that. And I think we've got farms that are really doing some amazing work in that regard. And then an R&D perspective is about what is the step change? Where do we get those step changes? And we can talk a little bit about that, I think, as part of my next myth, or milking the truth. Yeah.
So just on that, and playing devil's advocate, coming back to your statement around, in developing country, they're milking 4 cows now. It says 2 cows.
Yeah.
But we might have a farm here. It would be highly unusual. We're still milking 600. Our milk at 612 years ago. But in that circumstance, why should we be doing something? They are doubling their emissions. Why?
Why? Yeah, because if you look at the total, the point source emissions from a 600 cow dairy farm compared to a 4 cow dairy farm, then that point source there is going to be a lot larger. The amount of emissions in the litre of milk might be lower on the 600 farm. But if we think about how we're going to disperse food across the globe, I don't think that we just go all the economic developed parts of the world where we've got the most efficiencies should be where we produce all the food. I think we have a role about that, and we do that well, but we also need to understand not just economic and environmental drivers, but the importance of social drivers in where people farm and what that looks like. And so those animals are part of that family and region might be really important as a dual source of use and also income, and how they play really important roles in social fabrics. Our effort should be about how do we effectively help that developing world get to the levels of those efficiencies, because we need to feed people. And so, it's nice just to sit here and think politically, and across the world you can just click your fingers and everyone will get along. That would be nice. We say, well, we don't all get along at the moment, and I don't think that's helpful, but the globe doesn't differentiate between that.
No.
And so we've got to think about the environmental implications, but we've also got to think about the social implications of how we do that. And so there is a role for the science that has been developed and the husbandry and the great practices that we see in our part of the world to actually share that knowledge. And I think people are generally trying to do that.
Yeah.
Global politics sometimes can get in the way of that, I imagine, and I'm not equipped to talk on that, so we won't talk on that on our podcast. But I probably just simplify it down to, I look onto that data quite a lot at the Cape Grim data, and you just see, methane in the atmosphere tracking up, and the science around greenhouse gases and understandings were done in the early 1900s. But this isn't new. So people talked about what it would be like if greenhouse gases in the atmosphere went up, particularly CO2, and how much warming that would create. And then at the time, people didn't think that was possible because a lot of that's able to be absorbed by our forest and our oceans and the like. And so they never envisaged a world where we'd see the rise in CO2 that we've seen in greenhouse gases. But, our energy use is just gone, I think it's gone up 23 times since the 1900s, and our population's gone from 2 billion to 8 billion, but our demand for energy and use has driven a lot of our economic development. And so we can't ignore that, our very privileged way of life, in a way, and our economic development has been driven by, cheap energy.
Yeah.
It has. And so, but this consequence, and so I know that's separate to dealing with the methane story, but, that's a I think, understand the difference between those two gases that we've talked about. And so as we've developed and been able to, develop our food sources and create industries around that, we've been able to support that growing population. And now we also need to understand, well, what can we do as we move forward? And some of it's very hard. And I think people need to respect that it is very hard.
Yeah. It's going to take a culture shift almost, because if you think about it, like, we are creating the problem, but we don't want to change ourselves to fix the problem. We're quite comfortable with our split system and our wood heaters and our...
Yeah, but I think we'll transition to a low carbon economy, and we're seeing that, where we get our energy sources from and that. But they all need to be transitioned in a way that makes sense. And I think that's the transition that we're going through, and we see that, in the discussion around renewables versus the renewable energy sources and the price differentials and the politics that sit around that. I think when we talk about food production, so globally, food has a footprint, agriculture, depends where you look, well, it might be around the 14% mark, okay? But then you've got the pre-farm gate, you've got the post-farm gate that goes into all of that. Now dairy is a little bit different. A lot of ours, 90% is associated at the farm gate. But when we look across the agri-food sector, in agri-food, you've got maybe close to 30% of the global emissions associated with that. So there's opportunity pre and post-farm gate with those emerging technologies as well to help us lower that. And I think we have seen the amount of emissions that's associated with food production from that point of view, and the people have come down. But there's some things within the farm gate that are really challenging, and enteric methane's one of them, because it's a biological process. It's evolved for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's meant to, okay, and, next one to talk a little bit about is, I don't think it's as simple as you just stop that.
No, well, we can't, because our cows are designed or built like that they produce the methane because they're just standing in the paddock.
Yeah, so we've got, in a sense, particularly when we look at fermentation of pasture in this sense, hemicellulose and cellulose lignans, not much good, but we think about the fermentation that occurs, and part of that is the H2 that we need to then remove, and that can find it's, what we end up with is VFAs, volatile fatty acids, that produce our milk and produce the growth. But we've also got to deal with the H2 component, and the most effective mechanism of doing that is through the methanogens that combine that with CO2. And that's what, so we get about 6.5% of gross energy intake that's coming leaves as methane on average. But that's evolved to be an effective way of dealing with end of fermentation. If we just come along and block that, then I think we need to understand that maybe the animal's going to push back a little bit against that. So what can we achieve? And so there's two, and I don't want to talk about different products per se and things, but I would classify that our feed additives for mine come in two different forms. They come in those that can modify the rumen in a sense, so those that, can lower the population of the methanogens and lower the level of methane, but not inhibit the methane forming process, so they're not an enzyme inhibition. And in a way, they're trying to redirect a bit of that hydrogen more to productivity. Now, they will get us, what I can see, they might be our 5 to 10% changes. We know some of our inhibitions of enzymes, whether natural sources or synthetic sources, offer greater promise than that, because they actually inhibit that process. They inhibit that enzymes process that's associated with that formation. Now, when you inhibit something, it can be a bit more challenging. And I think that's the bit that we're just trying to work through. And so there's always been this school of thought in a way that, because it's a lost energy process, if you stop methane, then you'll get a productivity uptick. Energy's got to go somewhere. In a way that somewhat makes sense. But then what we've sort of found, and particularly recent work literature is becoming more prevalent in this, we're not seeing that response when we're removing methane. I think we need to understand why that might be. And so is the animal pushing back because, we've changed that environment in the rumen, we've changed maybe the partial pressure in the rumen, and are we affecting fermentation and sending end of fermentation signals, and the animals maybe not as eating as effectively or as much as she did. So we might be getting a feed conversion efficiency benefit, but she may be eating less. And so people might take that as a good news story, and it is if you can balance it, but I think we need to just be a little bit cautious that, an animal that eats well is a healthy animal. Yeah.
So that leads really well into your final statement, which was methane abatement through feed additives and other inhibitors is a win-win and therefore a silver bullet.
Yeah, well,
not a silver bullet then, Richard?
Well, no, we'd love to be able to say, I think we also do a lot of work to screen these processes. So we put these test tube an in vitro process, so where we mimic a ruminant environment in a way, and that allows us to screen, and we get some really promising solutions to that. And then we go more to the animal, which is our in vivo studies. And as I said, they're not cheap to run, and we need really capable groups and people to do that. And that is happening. There's some great work going across, not only just here in Australia, but globally. There's a really concerted effort to do this and quantifying what that methane abatement looks like in the animal. And sometimes that animal's not in a natural state either, so she might be in what's the respiration chambers, and you're measuring that flow, and that gives us a good understanding of the likely transfer from what we see in vitro to what we see in a controlled environment. And then we go out to scale, and that's what part of our work's around that scalability of these solutions. Because it's not just, are they effective, can you scale them? And then we've got the questions around, do they make sense from a price point for farmers? So how much that is cost? The cow produces, on average at the moment, if we took carbon at around $40 a tonne, about 50 cents of methane a day. Okay, so if you think of a feed additive that might be abating, let's just say 20%, okay, for that to sort of wash its own face is around 10 cents a day. Okay, so so that's where it gets to, and some of these feed additives are a little bit more than that. Obviously, if they could abate more, but then we've got to understand what that would mean from the animal's point of view as well. I think we have seen some work around, particularly those inhibit methane as you push to higher levels. So there's a bit of feed refusal come into play, and so we need to understand that. The feed conversion efficiency stories I talked about, and so is there other things that we need to feed with these feed additives, and how complementary can they be? Can you stack them? And so that's where some of the work is going at the moment. So that's exciting, but it takes time, it takes resources. And so I think we just need to not just go, if you stop methane, you're going to have a whole lot of productivity benefit. That understanding, or there's not enough in what I've conceived through the great science and work that people have done coming through, and all the papers I read that suggest that that's a clear example. Like I said, those that maybe modify the rumen to a certain degree, get a little bit of productivity uptick, but they probably don't offer as much opportunity around the methane abatement story. But they're probably the ones that we can adopt now, and so they're the things we should do a little bit of work on. So they're the rumen modifiers, and they're probably ones that do cost, a couple of cents per cow per day. Yeah. And so we probably should understand, how they fit to our systems and how does that work, and think about that. And then we think about, well, what's going to take us to that next step? I think there's still a fair bit to go. Great that we've got options. Great that people are doing some excellent work around, looking at that. But we've still got some way to go. I don't think it's just a matter of plug and play some of those things straight off the shelf right now. Yeah.
So for some of those feed additives, what I understand is there needs to be almost a constant supply of them, or the inhibitor. Is that right? So how easy will they be to plug into a pasture system compared to, like, I can imagine in a TMR shed system, that'd be quite easy.
That's a good point. There's a couple of bits around, and I'm fiercely biased here. I don't hide my bias, I suppose, just own them.
Neither do I, which is
I'm a pasture systems person. I've seen cows and grass and like the idea of that. But, and that's not to say that confinement systems haven't been really important around the efficiencies. If we just look through the lens of some aspects of that, if we just look through the lens, then, high performing cows in a barn system are probably going to have a lower embedded emissions than the grey system. Why? Because they might be doing 12,000 litres versus our cows doing 6, so they will dilute maintenance. But those cows might only be in the herd for two lactations, where ours might be in the herd for 6. So lifetime emissions become an important part. We've got ours in a grass-based system where people might have a different social value around cows grazing in pastures and barn systems. And then, and so it's not, and again, should take my own Vice versa, as I said earlier on, I think people tend to just point and not own the whole truth. So I think, particularly those barn systems have really good opportunity to manage the nutrient loads in a certain way. And so there's some real upsides to that. But, I happily own my own bias. So I work in pasture-based systems and really passionate about them. I love grass and seeing cows eat grass. And so from that point of view, I also got to think that some of the feed additives are probably more easily adopted in barn systems. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you can control the intake a lot easier because every mouthful can be homogenised, mixed, and the right level of feed additive. So the ability to control dosing in those systems, particularly when we come to the more efficacious, more effective feed additives, those that probably act as inhibitors. It's really probably important around what that target dose is, and so that's probably a little bit easier to manage in a feedlot situation where every mouthful's got a kilo of feed and just the right level. If we think about what happens in a dairy context, and we've even had this when we talk about feeding wheat, but the impacts of feeding something that's readily degradable from a starch perspective as a slug feed, we know that challenges the rumen environment, and we've found effective ways to manage that, buffers and understanding and milling and mixing with slower rates of degraded starch. I think we've got that same challenge around that. If we're going to feed animals, feed additives at the dairy, then we need to understand implications of that pulse feeding, and that may limit how much, or what can we do around things that might act as slow release in the rumen for these additives, because not every mouthful of diet on a grass-fed system is going to have that feed additive in them.
Yeah.
They're bound to get certain opportunities. Or what is the delivery mechanisms that we can do out at scale in paddocks is, administering feed additives through water troughs, lick blocks, loose licks. These are some of the bits. But if you look at I suppose just through, economic rationalisation, if you was to think about where your market is for a feed additive and the easiest parts for that, then that's why we'll probably see a feed additive more highly adopted in feedlot systems, because the path to that probably doesn't have some of these challenges.
Yeah.
So for us around the globe, whether it's Ireland, New Zealand, parts of Australia, for grass systems, and I like to see that our milk's produced from grass systems. I think there's some real importance to that. Grass is a really cheap source of feed. It's been the profitability of our industry and growth that we've seen. Tasmania been one of the states that have sort of bucked that trend of decline in Australia. And so I think what we need to think about is we've got low emissions from grass-fed systems, but we may not have some of the step change technologies as soon as others. But what can we do in the gap, and how do we fill that gap in between as well, I think is an important element. And I think some of our grass systems have set some really important targets around where we're at now and where we can get to, because we are globally competitive on an emissions intensity basis, but we don't have, some of the manure management systems are probably not as transferable, so we don't have methane digesters a lot, because a lot of our dung is obviously deposited on pastures. And then we've got probably this challenge also around what's the right feed additives that we can feed in a pasture-based system. Yeah. So that's the areas of work, because we don't want to be losing that advantage that we've got. Farms have worked hard to be really competitive and have a low footprint, but we do need to find step changes, and parts. I just think some of those step changes are coming in certain systems, and we need to keep working hard around what that means for grass-fed systems. So how transferable, what are the knowledge gaps we need to close? And that's sort of the interface we work at. And back to your original question, do farmers think about that? I think there's an element of people that are helping us, that's no doubt. And then there's the element of those that are just, focused on making their systems better each day and more efficient, and that's helping also.
And that's the interesting thing I find when we look at emissions. A lot of it is around improving on-farm efficiency. That 600 cow farm that you talked about earlier that's doing the same thing 12 years later, you'd be hard pushed to find that.
That's right, because they wouldn't.
There's so much technology change.
Yeah, it probably wasn't. There was more just to say that their emissions profile was low, but there's no doubt when we look over the last 15, 20 years and go back, we'll talk about the breeding efforts that go on, and breeding's going to be one of those things that continue to compound, and we should continue to support the understanding and investments in those spaces. The work that people have done around, their optimisation of cow performance. I think there's some real Because no one likes to see animals that are, you do all that effort to raise a calf, then you're rising ones and rising twos to grow out a good heifer, come into the herd and then disappear after 1 or 2 lactations.
Yeah.
And so that's not great from an emissions point of view, because all the emissions associated from pretty much from the time the rumen is developed as a calf right through to when she gives birth, and then you start getting milk, all those emissions have contributed nothing to the productivity. So you've got to wear all of them. Then we look at, okay, well, that is best then managed by having that cow in the herd for longer. So longevity in the herd becomes an important component. I think we have got a lot better at that.
Yeah.
And so, we just, all of those things that people can think about that's important to their business will certainly help that underlying efficiencies of emissions. And then we've got that global challenge. If you think about what we've got to do, as I talked about, to turn the worm such that the sweater or the glass in the car or cardigan doesn't get thicker, we've got to get the global level to come back. And that's a responsibility not just for those of us that are producing food or those that are transporting us around the globe. That's a collective effort.
Do you reckon we can do it? Can we bring that back?
I think there's going to be an element of both components here. One is, if I look at the trajectory, the budget we spend about, as a global population and output, in rough numbers, it's around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalents I talked about before that goes out each year. And to keep that under about 2 degrees of warming, I think the global budget might be around 1,100. So it's 21, 22 years. So we've got to continue to find ways to get that down, and it's got to come down at a pretty rapid rate.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be a challenge in a number of ways, because that transition that we've talked about, stationary energy and where we get things and energy sources from and the like, there's going to be a pretty rapid transition to that. And don't want to get ins and outs, but, when we look at how some of that's influenced and the politics that sit around that, and then we, what's the right support to those transitions? That's a big global challenge, but we will need to, from a agri-food point of view, we will need adaptation as well as mitigation. I don't think we're going to mitigate, and that's just not from our food sectors, but globally, mitigate fast enough that adaptation isn't the challenge.
We might start to wrap up. One of the things I like to do when we talk about something that can be and can feel quite large for people, like it can feel like we're talking global things, we're talking something that's can feel quite out of our control in terms of managing temperature increases and methane and all those sorts of things. What's one thing that the farmer listening to this could do on their farm? Just one change that they could do that'll make even just the smallest bit of difference.
Educating yourself about this, but not to burden yourself with what that looks like. Think about what is the one thing that makes sense to you now that will make your number lower.
Yep.
Okay, because for some it might be, I'm willing to do this with the feed additive, I'm willing to do this new technology. For someone else, it might just be the attention to understanding how I take my reproductive performance from what might be average to great.
Yep.
And that might be through, staff training or better identification of heath or something like that. So for some farms that might not be able to, for some farms they might have already really got a really great repro performance, but there might be something else that they might be able to focus in on. Have they had an energy audit done? These sorts of things. So I think if I said one message that could be overreaching or sits over the top for all is understand what we're talking about here. I get somewhat disappointed at times when we try to point fingers and also say, oh, it's not ours, we can't, it's 5% of the global emissions and the number of ruminants in Australia compared globally is only a small percentage of my farm, and so my contribution is negligible. It might be, but how many ants does it take to lift a car? They would do it, wouldn't they? This is so. And I'm not saying that you should burden yourself with that responsibility. What I'm saying is understand that globally we've got a budget on emissions that when we spend that budget, what it looks like, it becomes even more challenging, not for just you as an individual, but for everyone. And so part of that understanding then is what is the role that I can play that I can do? And it's got to make sense for you. And that might be improving my repro performance. It might be having less unproductive animals on there, so less lameness or the like. It might be around getting energy efficiency. It might be around limiting my nitrogen inputs and still grow the same amount of grass. And so there's a whole lot of things that is possible, but just understanding that if you improve in that area and it makes sense for you to improve in that area, then that's a good outcome. And I'd like to see that as part of our metrics that we are tracking how much better we're getting, and then allow the underlying support that the science can get us to some of those step changes. And from a science and an R&D perspective, then we just got to get to work and see what we can solve. But it's not, I think we don't want to sit there and say we can do 90% abatement if there's an understanding that that's got challenges associated with it. I think that creates unrealistic expectations. Great if we can get there. Let's see what's possible right now. And so it's about me understanding and then go, what can you do? What can we collectively do right now that gets us in the right direction? And the good, like I said, right back to the start, the good news story of that is that they're not losses in productivity or profitability that come with that. When they don't work in opposite directions.
Yeah.
They go together.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's the good news. Yeah. Long way to get to that point, Liz, but we got that. So
we might finish on that good news point, I reckon, Richard.
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining me. That's been awesome.
Yep.
If people do want to know their number, there is the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. That's available.
Well, we don't want to jump, but encouraging people to do their physical performances through Dairy Base is great.
Yes. Yep.
And that will then give you your carbon number.
Yep.
But more importantly, it gives you some indications of the physical performance areas that might be the right target for you.
Yeah.
And so that would make sense for you from a farm systems productivity, profitability benefit, and it will also improve your number. And so do the physical benchmarking. So you might say, I think I could actually improve in this area. And you'll find that if you do, then your number will come down. And so I think that's the key bit. Yeah.
Get out and benchmark.
Yeah.
It's something we've been saying for years, Richard.
Yeah, it is an important part.
Yeah.
And I think for some people, when I look at that, it might be that there's the farm physicals and financials go together, and that the financials are going to be part, but even just benchmarking where your physicals sit around some of these important bits.
Yeah.
So, knowing what your cows are doing per kilo of body weight and where you'd like to get to and what makes sense, and then get on that journey, or knowing where your 6-week king calf rate is, and knowing whether you've got room for improvement in that. That'd be wins.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure chatting with you as always, Richard.
Likewise, you. Thank you so much.
That's
Talk soon.
For more information about how Dairy Australia supports dairy farmers with managing climate and environment, visit dairyaustralia.com.au/climate and environment. We have also placed this and other related links in the episode notes. We hope that you have enjoyed this DairyPod episode. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, you can get in contact with us by emailing dairypod@dairyaustralia.com.au. Thank you for listening.